Today's daf, Emir Hashem, is daf Nun Daled, but we'll start with the Gemara on the bottom of Nun Gimel, Amid Beis, where we stopped yesterday. The Mishnah says that Habal Yevimto bein shogeg ubein b'mezid, afilu hu shogeg vehi mezid. So the Gemara says the language of the Mishnah makes no sense. My afilu, what does it mean? Even if he's a shogeg and she's a mezida, what's the afilu here? What's the chiddush? You already told me that as far as the Kinyan Yovim is concerned, there's no difference between Bia B'Shogeg or Bia B'Mezid. So the Gemara says, Lo mi boy kam. The method the literary method that applies here in this Mishnah is Lo mi boy. Lo mi boy goes without saying in a case of Hu Shogeg, Vehi Kamechavna, the mitzvah. At least one of them had kavana for the mitzvah, which would be in this case, she had kavanah mitzvah. Inami, or another scenarios who mezid the he kamachav the mitzvah, whether he's a shogi or mezid, but she had kavanah l'shem mitzvah. And in these cases, it goes without saying that there's a kiyum of yibum, because at least there's some kavanah on one side of the seesaw. Ella says the Mishnah, I have bigger chiddush. Hu shogeg v'himazida. In other words, there's no kavanah l'shem mitzvah on either side. He's a shogeg, he thinks he's having a relationship with his own wife, and she's a mezida, she's just having fun. Is the travayu lo kamacham l'shem mitzvah? And nevertheless, the kinyan is even if both of them were lacking in kavanah. Rabbi Chia, we have a brisa. Rabbi Chia pilu shneim shogim shneim mezidim shneim anusim. In other words, neither on his side nor on our side is there any kavanah l'shem mitzvahs. Give him nevertheless honor. The Gemara now continues to clarify the Mishnah. It says anus. He was anus. What's the case of anus? The Goyim threatened him that if he doesn't have this relationship with his Yevamot, they'll put him to death. Again, what motivates the Goyim, I have no clue. Anyway, Ba'aleha, as a result, to save his life, he was pressured to have beer with her. Such a case, he certainly is not an onus. Why? Hamarava ain't honestly ever think when a person is forced into a mice beer and he has an erection, he does. So therefore, it's not an onus. So you can't say that he doesn't have an intention. He's actively participating in the Maisa. Ella would rather be Yoshi. So he had an erection while he was sleeping, and she had a relationship with him, pushing herself on him, and he's an onus. And the kishi itself is even ba'onus. At least in the case where they put a gun to his head, his kishi was bidat, but here it was ba'onus. And the Gemara rejects this also. Is it really true that a bia biyoshen is considered a bia? And here's where we're going to start today's daf Nun Daled. Omar Rav Yehuda, yoshen lo kana biyavimto. It's not considered das, and therefore there's no ma'isa bia that could be related to him. And we need at least some sort of ma'isa bia. But if he's a yoshen, that's not das. Here we have machloks between Rashi and the other Rishon. Rashi interprets it that he's not a bar das because he's a yosher, and therefore he cannot be kona b'yavam. The Gemara has a havmini that a katan could be kona yavam, except for miyut Torah. So you see that you don't need a ben das. Or for example, a chirich is moel yibum, even though he's not a ben das. Therefore, the other Rishonim reject Rashi, and they write the reason why Yoshen is not meaningful and effective in Yibum is because of the explanation the Gemara is going to give now, that you need kavanas bia. And in the case of Yoshen, he doesn't have kavanas bia. Whereas in the case of a katan or a chiresh, even though they don't have das, and it's a labar das, but nevertheless they do have kavanas bia. Yoshen is even one level below that, and he doesn't have kavanas bia. Ella says the Gemara, if you're telling me that we're looking for a case where he could be kona be honest, it's not a case where they forced him because in that case is teaching me not. It's not a case of Yoshein because when I was saying that Yoshein that doesn't have kavanah l'chayviyah. So what could be a case where he's kona be a vimto be'onest? Ella says the Gemara bin niska. We're talking about a case of a person who had an erection for his wife, and he fell onto a Yevamot. So this is called derech bia. He's honest in this bia. He had no control over the bia because he thought he was ready for bia with his wife. And the Gemara rejects this as well. V'ha'amar Rabba nafal min hagag v'niska chayiv be'arba dvarim but b'yavimta lo kana. Rabba holds that if a person falls from a gag into a woman's situation of bia, then that's not considered a ma'isa bia at all. Lo kana. It's not kona. Again, we're looking for a case of onus where he is kona. Rabba says that here we have a difference, a fundamental difference between the din of Adam Hamazik and the din of Kinyan. If the bia was mazikar, he'll be chayav v'nezik tzar ripuy and sheves, because the Torah says petzah tachat potzah, which includes even shogeg and even ones. He's not chayav in boshes because for boshes he kavana levayish. But a yavam who fell and was nitka b'yavimto lo kana. That's not a kinyan bia. And perhaps that's not even a ma'isa bia at all. He says, "Lo niskamin lebia b'nefilu zu." So in order to set up a ma'isa bia, you need kavanah l'shem bia. He didn't have kavanah l'shem bia. So what must be the case of an onus where he was going? Sheniskamin leishto uskafatu yivimto uba alem. So we're talking about a case where he again was prepared to have a relationship with his wife. So he had a kochi. And now she comes along, grabs Hayavon Ba'ones, and as a result, Ba'aleh. So the Yevamah herself brought him on top of her, or forced him to the Ma'aseh Bia. And in that case, he's called an Anus, but he does have an awareness of the fact that he's doing a Ma'aseh Bia. Again, this is a little difficult to me because I would say that this is a case what we call Karka Olam. That's not a Ma'aseh. The Gemara clarifies, Shnei Anusim debei Rabbi Chia. In the Bryce of Rabbi Chia, we had a case of Shnei Anusim. What case would that? Kigon sheniskamin leishto, uskafu ovdei kochavim v'dibkum zebazeh ba'alel. So they brought them together. So he's considered an anus because the principle of ein kishel doesn't apply here because he was already niskashel leishto. She's an anusa, but that's okay because we're going to see that Yibam is Kona even Balkar. Which means that if he has a choice between Yibum and Chalitza, he should choose the mitzvah of Yibum. So that this pasuk, Yevama Yovoleh, establishes the preference of the mitzvah of Yibum over Chalitza. Davracher, Yevama Yovoleh, Bein B'Shogi, Bein B'Mezid, Bein Bonus, Bein B'Rotz. So this Yevama Yovoleh is the source for the Alos Kinyan in all these cases where there was less than full Ratzon to be konaha. So the Gemara asks the following question: can we derive two things from the same pasuk? Fake day mitzvah. We needed the pasuk Yevamot to teach me that there's a mitzvah beer that comes before the mitzvah of chalitza. How can you now use the same pasuk to derive afilu b'shogig afilu ba'onis? And the Gemara answers at le mitzvah. If you want to derive that there's a mitzvah beer over chalitza, I have a different pasuk. The ve'im lo yachbot then b'choltza nafka. Let's derive from there, because the strong implication is that it's only in this kind of b'diavad fallback position that we implement chalitza. Chafetz, if it was l'chatchila that he wants to be mekayim the mitzvah the way he should with yibum, then yabim is a mitzvah to yabim. And now we have another pasuk, meaning the pasuk Yevamot Yavoleh, to establish that he's konas Yevamot bein b'shogig bein b'mezid bein ba'onis bein b'rotz. Tanya idach, and we learned in an additional brayso Yevamot Yavoleh, and that means kidarka. Ulekacha. We have another pasuk, another word in the pasuk that's redundant to teach us a reboot. Ulekacha af shelo kedar. Now the next part of the pasuk says v'yibma, which means a beer, and that's also unnecessary in the pasuk redundant. And let's derive from that the bein beer gomeres ba v'ein shtar v'ein kesfu shtar gomer. That when it says v'yibma, it means only through yibum can he be konahar, but not through kesef and shtar, which normally in a regular case the alma of kedushin would be chal, and he'd be konah. So ein kesef and shtar gomer ba. They cannot clinch the kinyan issues in the case of Yevamot. Now the Gemara says, or the brayso, that there's an extra hey at the end of the Yevamot. You could have said the ben. And Yevamot means even Bal Karcha he could become. Dover Acher, a different brayso. Yevamot Yavoleh, and that tells me in any way whatsoever. Bein b'shogig, bein mezid, ba'onis b'rotzon. Where it says again, the same objection of fakte, I need that pasuk, different drasha, likidarka, that he's konen the Yevamot v'bia kidarka. So the Rishonim, Rashba and Ritva, they ask, why can't you interpret the pasuk that kidarka means even the shogig or even the mezid? And we would still know that it's bia kidarka. So on that there's a long discussion. Anyway, hahu, that derivation that he's kona in ba'aleh kidarka, that I derive from lahakim li'achiv shem nafka. That's where I derive. That the essence and the agenda, the goal of mitzvahs yibum is b'makom shemekim shem, which means that there could be a child, and that means bia kidarka. Now I can use the pasuk Yevamot Yavoleh. It becomes free because the din of kidarka I derive from lahakim li'achiv shem. That's going to teach me bein b'shogig, bein b'mezid, bein ba'ones, bein b'rotzon. Gufa, Amar of Yehuda, Yoshen lo kana b'yavimto. So Yehuda is of the opinion that he doesn't have a maisa bia when he's asleep, and therefore he cannot be konen in Yevamot. And the source for that is the Yom Kra, Yevamot Yavo Oleh. Adam Achavin Lo. L'shem Bia. He didn't have Kavanah L'shem Bia, and therefore he's not Konaha in the case of Yoshem. Vatanya, the Gemara asks, what about the brayso that says Bein Er, Bein Yoshem? So we're going to rewrite this brisa. Ema bein era bein yichena. No, it's hussish. It's not relevant. She doesn't need a maisa bia, but he would have to be awake in order to qualify for a maisa bia. We don't need her kavanah l'shem mitzvah. We need his kavanah l'shem bia. But we have a brisa that says bein er hu, bein yoshin hu, bein era he, bein yishena he. So it's explicit that even if he's asleep, he could be kona. The brisa doesn't refer to a yoshin in the full sense. He's not in a state of slumber, but rather he is falling asleep. He's sort of like dozing off. So at what point do you say, well, he hasn't crossed the border into slumber, he's misnamning? How do you gauge it? Omrav Ashi nim velo nim tir velo tir. He's sleeping, he's not sleeping. He's awake, but he's not awake. In other words, he's not awake completely, he's not sleeping completely. So he's somewhere in the middle. That's called misnamne. Kigon. How would you give me a litmus test? To Kari Levi Ani. If you say his name, he'll wake up. Yoda Ladure Svara. He won't be able to give you a logical answer because his mind is not totally sharp. If you remind him of something that he knows or he knew in the past, then midkar he'll remember. So again, it's in this mental state which is partially functioning and partially not. He's capable of a maisa with kavod. Gufa marabin nafal minagag v'niskachayim tashmir b'dvar b'yavim talokana. So what are the 5 things that he's chayav in if he falls off a roof and he had a relationship, a bia with a woman on the bottom and he damaged her? He's chayav nezek, star. So what's nezek? Nezek means we evaluate the woman as if she was a shifra sold in the market. We see how much she devaluated as a result of this nezek. And that's the discrepancy that he pays. And what's bitsar? Tsar is the amount of suffering. That's how much would a person pay to avoid such pain. Sheves, let's say, a person could not, check in for work because he was a chola. The ripui is the, physician's fees or hospital fees. So a person fell from a roof. Again, there's an element of chia here. He should have been more careful, but nevertheless, he didn't have kavanah lahazik. He didn't do it deliberately, and therefore he is not considered a mavayish. He's part from both. Soma Rabbah. And again, we're talking about Yavam now, and a beer without kavanah. And it's kavin latiach the kosel. So his organ is somehow getting, pressed up against the wall. So he's penetrating a woman here. So his Yevama, he didn't have a maisa kavanah for a maisa beer for Yevama, but he tiach v'yevimto lokon. He didn't have kavanah l'shem beer. Somehow he slipped and fell or something, and he had a beer. But if he had kavanah latiach b'behema, one could ostensibly argue that is kavanah for maisa beer. He tiach b'yevama, and instead of being matiach in the behema, he was matiach b'yevama kana. That's considered a shame beer. I mean, if you have a relation with an animal, that's also considered a beer. There's some sort of penetration. And that's also a beer ba'olam, meaning he didn't have kavanah for beer for this woman and for Yivu, but nevertheless he had kavanah l'shem beer, and that's enough. We start a major sugya of hara, which is otherwise known as tchilas bia. So he partially penetrates, but not completely. And we saw in that Mishnah, whether he completes his bia or only starts it, he's kona biyavim. Omer ula minayin lahara minat Torah. How do we know that the Torah recognizes the tchilas bia as if it were a complete bia? Shenemar, because in the parsha Nida, so here we're looking about Arayas, and the assumption is if that it qualifies as a bia for Isar Erva, then it would also qualify bia as a Kinyan Yibum. Shenemar ish asher yishkavas isha dava v'gilas ervasa es mekora hera v'nichresu, etc. So the pasuk says hera. Hera means he only partially penetrated, and she's a nida, and he's chayiv karis, the Torah says. Mekora hera. So the Isur is not dependent upon bia gemura, but hera is enough. Umikan la'ara minat Torah. And he's chayiv for bia gemura, even though all he did was hara. Ashkechan nida, maybe that's a separate chumrah in nida. Shara is minayin. How do we know in all erva? This is a principle of binyan for all erva. And with chitema, you'll tell me nelif minida. The case of nida is unique. You can't derive from nida because mala nida shkematam is boel. Right? The boel of a nida is tami shivas yomim, which is a very unusual kind of tumah. And basically, in Parsha, in Vayikra Tesvav, Im Shachov Yishkav Ha'ish Osa V'Tehi Nidasa Olav V'Tamei Shivas Yomim. You can have a beer with a nida who's on a 5th, 6th, 7th day, and yet he becomes a full nida for 7 days. And he has the din of a nida to be metame odom ukli cheres behesed. The exception here is mishkav Moshe. He's only metame mishkav Moshe of le ochlin umashki, but not like a nidos metame mishkav Moshe of letame odom ubgod of olah. So we see there's a chumrah in nida that it's metame as bola, and therefore that tumah is more chamur, and the Torah is machmir to set up a violation of the Isur of bilas nida with hara-in-law. Ella says we can now derive the Isur hara from Eshesach, the ish asher yikachas Eshesach nida he. And the pasuk calls her a nida. Why is Eishes Achim a nida? The Eishes Achim le'olam nida, but she continues to see dam nidas, perpetually, forevermore. So why is she called a nida? Ella, to compare Eishes Ach to a nida. Kin nida, ma nida ba'ara, af Eishes Ach ba'ara. Mar says, you know what? I have a chumrah in Eishes Ach. Mal Eishes Ach shekain biyodo l'rabos. He can get married. Well, not he actually. His brother can get married. The makadesh adam ki alpha. If a man would marry 1,000 women, with each additional marriage, he's being marbed the Isur Eishes Ach on his brother. So it's possible the reason why the Torah was machmir in Eishes Ach and upgraded to the status of nida, in which you're chayiv hara, that's a reflection of the chumrah of Eishes Ach. Asya, let's derive it me achos av achos em. Your father's sister, your mother's sister. Dichsiv v'ervas achos imecha v'achos avicha lo sigale ki es she'ero ha'ara avonam yiso. So it's clear from this pasuk that the Yitzer Hara is considered like Bia in the case of Achos Av and Achos Em. So let's use them as a binyan Av to derive all our rights that are is Asur. And what's Ezekiel and Mifrach? I have a pircha on these cases of Achos Imo and Achos Aviv, Malachos Av, Vachos Em, Shekain Iser Haba Me'elov. There's no Maisa Mitzada Adam. So the Torah is machmer in this case because the Iser Ereva sort of emerges automatically on its own. But if you have an Ereva that is generated by your own Kiddushin, then maybe the Torah wasn't so machmer. In the note here, he says the following, that if Eshes Ach was more machmir because with his Kiddushin, he can continuously expand the scope of the Iser Erva, that doesn't tell me that the Torah is machmir for an Erva that ain't biyodo l'rabos. Kigon imo, achoso, ubito. Aval isurim. And Nesra, yedei ishus, shebiyad yolo shal odom l'rabos osam kigon eshes av, shu yochel li nose l'kamen noshim gertsono. So that from Eshes Ach, which has that chumrah of Yochel Lerabos, which came be Yodel Lerabos, we're going to derive all the cases of Yodel Lerabos. But we cannot derive Imo, Achoso, and Bito, because there it's not Yodel Lerabos. And if you're going to use Achos Av and Achos Em, which is not Yodel Lerabos, and that'll be a source to derive Imo, Achos, and Bito, I'm going to have a pircha that Achos Av and Achos Em is an Isra Bami Ela. So it's very interesting because if you divide the Arayis into these two categories that are so fundamentally different, one that is a result of Kiddushin, Maisa Adam, and the other that is automatic, it's Bami Elov, then basically we have representation of both of these categories in Hara. Because if you're talking about a case where it's Al Yidei Adam, Machmas Kiddushin, and that would be less chomer than an Isra B'Meil of Lo Ma'isad, then I'm going to quote to you Eshes Ach, which is again a case of Machmas Kiddushin, and yet the Torah prohibits Hara, which we derive from Nida. And if you can tell me the opposite, let's be Machmer in the case of Eshes Ach, because he could be Marba the Easter. So we get all those, arayas that fit into the category of Al Yidei Maisa Adam. So then I'll ask you, what about those arayas that he cannot be Marba? Like, for example, Imo Achos and Bito. But it seems that each one has a chumrah unto itself, and yet both categories have the upgrade of Halara can be a Gemura. The Gemara says, maybe we could join forces with a tzad shava between two arayos that are nesu ba'ara. But again, we don't know which two yet. That's what Gemara is going to enter into an entire campaign, entire project of trying to figure out which two and how to construct the tzad shava. Hey, taste. Let's go through the various possibilities. Number one, Teise mi eishes av v'achos av achos ev. I mean, that seems like a great kind of tzad shava, because if you're going to object with a pircha eishes ach, wait a minute, eishes ach has a chumah that's biyod l'rabos, what are you going to do with achos av and achos ev? I mean, a sister is a sister, she's born. There's no action that you could be marba the arayos. And if, on the other hand, you don't want to derive from achos of achos imo, because that has a chumrah of an isa babi elav, what are you going to do with eishes ach, where there's an hara be a gemur, even though any surah babi elav? The Gemara says even that joint forces still lends itself to a pircha. And why so? She'er means kurvas mishpacha. So when it's kurvas mishpacha, the Torah upgrade Torah to be considered like bia gemura. For example, in the cases of eishes ach, achos av, achos em, I mean, these are all kurva. But if you have an erva, that the isur of that erva has nothing to do with kurva, for example, eishes ich, she's not only asur to relatives, she's asur l'kol ha'olam, so it has nothing to do with kurva. How do you know that even in that case of eishes ich, the Torah prohibits hara kibiyah? Ella says, the Gemara teisi mi nida ve'achos av ve'achos em. And both of these we found hara is asur can be a gemura. Now nida is not an isa she'er and kurvas mishpacha, and yet hara is prohibited. So we're going to derive from nida all arayas, and then you'll ask me the percha. Well, nida as a chumra mitaris bolus. I'll quote to you achos av and achos em, and if you'll tell me that's kurva, well, what about nida? But the Gemara has a percha even against that comment. Why malahanov? There's no Maisa Adam. So that the Torah might be makil in the case of a Maisa Adam. So if you have Nida, that's Ba'me'elav, it's Eno Al Yidei Maisa Adam. If you have Achos Av and Achos Em, which are not a sister, in this case, sister's father, sister's mother, it is not something that's created by Maisa Adam. So how can you derive other arayos where you need the Maisa Adam of a Kiddushin that ha'ar is considered like bia? So at this point, I would have introduced eishes ah. Ella says the Gemara, teisei min nida v'eishes ah. Demai pirchis, what's going to be your pirch on this derivation? You're going to say, well, can't derive from neither because it's Mitami's bowl. And it's also an Isser Haba Me'el. So then I'm going to introduce Eishes Ach. Eishes Ach is not Mitami's bola, and it's not Isser Haba Me'el. We need the Maisa Kiddush. And nevertheless, the Torah upgraded Hara Kibiyah. You'll have a pirch on Eishes Ach that it's not, quote, Isurim Shebiyodol Rabos, or it's Isurim Sheboy Machmas Kurvas Mishpacha, So the chumrah of Eishesach is one of two, either because you have the power to be marbe, or because it's a case of she'er and kurvas mishpach. So then neither tochia, because neither is not the other laharbos, and it's not kurvas mishpach, and yet the Torah says our kibir. So maskif Rav Acha berei Rav Ika malin nida v'eshes ach shekein ein lem heter b'chaye otzron tomar b'eshes ish shekein yesh lo heter b'chaye otzron. So who generates the isur of eshes ish, that erfa? It's him, the Baal, who's mekadosh. When he dies, she becomes muteres. Not only that, he can deliver a get, and even though he's still alive, she's muteres. So that's a kula in Eshes Ish. We don't have such a parallel kula neither in Nida nor in Eshesach. You want to build it Tzad Shava and derive hara can be a gemura from Nida plus Eshesach. Well, neither of them fit into a category of Ein La Heter B'Chai Otzna, of Heter B'Chai Otzna. They don't have a Heter B'Chai Otzna. What it means is that as long as it's a Gorema Isur, that's Chai V'Kayim, there's no Heter. And Nida, if she's seeing Dam, and in Eshesach, as long as the Ach who caused the Isur is still alive, even if he divorces her, he Asura Ola. Amalei Rav Acha midifti l'Ravina. Rav Acha now objects. It's interesting. There are two Rav Achas over here. We got to get them straight. There's Rav Acha midifti, and there's a Rav Acha berei the Rav Ika. The two different people. They're both Acha. But Rav Acha midifti is now objecting in front of Ravina to the nusach, the formula of the Shpircha as formulated by Rav Acha berei the Rav Ika. It's not meduyak. His language has to be fixed up a little. It's not the Rav Acha midifti is trying to slug up the Pircha. The Pircha is a valid Pircha. But the way you said it, that mal nida v'eshes achshe in lem heter b'chaye osran, otu nida v'eshes ach b'chaye osran hu de lem heter aval yachar mikan yesh lem heter. Now, if you're looking for a case where there's a heter even b'chaye osran, so it means in the case of nida liachar mikan means after she's posekes liros, or Eishes Ach after the Ach dies. That's what you're implying, that there will be a heter later on, but not a heter earlier. In the case of Eishes Ish, there's a heter as early as the time he gives her a get. But here you're telling me that the heter in Nid and Eishes Ach is after Chaya Osman. So if you take a look here on the top of the Dalit Beis, the Gemara says that Nida b'Yomei Talya Milsa and Eishes Ach b'Bonim Talya Rachman. So in other words, Nida depends upon Yomim. She saw a dam, she's Tmeach, Shivas Yomim, it doesn't matter how much dam she sees, Shivas Yomim. Eishes Ach is even after he dies, there's an Isur. You implied that after he dies, there's an Isur, like in Nida, after she stops seeing Nida, there's a heter. That was the implication of your words, but that's not so. Even if she stops seeing after one people's dam kechada, she's still Tmeah for Shevus Yomim. And in the case of Eishes Ach, even after his death, she still is Asura, just Bebanim Talya Milsa. And the Torah says that only if they're Banim, then she retains the status as Eishes Ach after his death. So you can't have a Pircha Malad Nida Eishes Ach she'ein lehem cheter b'chaye osram, but yesh lehem heter liachar chayosron, because that's not so. Because even after chayosron, they still don't have a heter, because the nida and the isa nida continues even after she stops seeing dam, and the isa veshasach continues even after the ach is gone. And Ella, we have to reformulate the pircha in a more meduyak way. But again, we're not arguing against the pircha per se.